Your panel is here. Thank you very much for your efficiency. Dr. Tyson, I shall allow you to introduce your panel. Have a very good session and see you shortly.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you again for the honor of having the opportunity to chair such a distinguished panel and to convene a first panel which we hope will be setting some of the bigger questions which will then be the guiding questions throughout the day. So as you can see, we're off to a terrific start with some very inspiring words from everyone. And so I guess it's our challenge to keep this up. We don't want to misstep here as a panel. We have a panel of extremely distinguished leaders. These are leaders from the NGO community, the philanthropic community, the business community, the academic community, and the public sector. So multi-sector leadership across all of the sectors that need to partner, as we heard from Chelsea, to have successful solutions. There's long discussions of their distinguished biographies in your materials, so I am going to try to say just a couple words about each and leave you to the rest. So my first panelist is Dr. David Rockefeller Jr. He is the director and former chairman of Rockefeller and Company. He is an active participant in the NGO area, particular interest in the arts, in the environment, and in philanthropy, and he serves as the board chair of the Rockefeller Foundation, obviously a globally known, long-standing foundation. Our second panelist is Sonal Shah. Sonal is a professor. She's founding director of a new Center for Social Impact and Innovation, the Beck Center at Georgetown University. She worked in the Obama administration as a special assistant to the president, helping to establish something entirely new in the White House, which is an Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation, to begin to think about how to use small amounts of government money, large amounts of government convening power to support social entrepreneurship and new social innovative methods to dealing with social challenges. She's also had distinguished experience in the private sector, both working on philanthropic and global development initiatives at Google, and before that, working on environmental issues at Goldman Sachs. Our third panelist is Faye Twersky. Faye, well actually our third is Paul. I've lost track. I can see that far, but not much further. Our third panelist is Paul Brest. Paul, like me, has spent a number of years of his life being dean at Stanford Law School. By the way, I want to say that Philanthropy University, I don't know if Chelsea's still here, we do have a lot of collaboration with Stanford, including Paul is chairing the curriculum committee of Philanthropy University. So Dean of the Stanford Law School, Professor Emeritus at the Stanford Law School, where he's still actively engaged. He also teaches at the Stanford School of Business, and he is a faculty co-director of a very influential center on the Stanford campus, the Center on Philanthropy and Civic Society. Now, he also wrote, and I told him sitting down there I have to read it, haven't read it yet, a book called Money Well Spent, A Strategic Guide to Smart Philanthropy. So if you haven't been doing your philanthropy smartly or strategically, I suggest reading Paul's book. That does bring me to Faye Twersky. She is the director of Effective Philanthropy Group at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. In that capacity, she oversees several functions, but her focus, and I was with her yesterday at a very interesting meeting talking about strategy for Philanthropy University, she focuses on strategy, on evaluation, on organizational learnings, how to make both that foundation and other philanthropic organizations more effective, more strategic. Very, very important. She has done that, similar jobs on the leadership team of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and for the Rothschild Family Foundation. And then finally, we have Sir Malcolm Grant. I got the pleasure of working with Sir Malcolm when I was the dean of the London Business School, and I do want to call out, you'll see up here and you'll see over the day, the important involvement of London Business School in philanthropreneurship as well. That's where I met His Excellency and a number of people here, including Malcolm. Malcolm was at that point heading the UCL, the provost and president of UCL. He describes that as the best job in higher education. London Business School wasn't too bad, and it was a little easier, actually, I suspect, Malcolm. But Malcolm has gone on to head the National Health Service as its chairman in England. Now, all of you know that the National Health Service is one of the premier health services in the world. People around the world look to the UK to understand how to finance, how to deliver, how to improve quality in the healthcare system. And we have Malcolm as the chair of that effort. So an extremely distinguished panel. We did have a discussion before starting yesterday, and we felt that we wanted to start with a general question to the panelists, turn to the audience to get some questions, turn back to the panel, and then back to the audience again. So we try to make it as interactive as possible. And the first question was really, this whole forum is about breaking frontiers, the need for innovative change, the need for fundamental change. And I wanted to ask each of them, because they're involved in the world of philanthropy and solving social challenges, do they actually believe there is a need for significant change? And if so, why? What's wrong with the existing models? How are they not delivering? And I think that's the way we'll start, and then we'll turn to the audience. I've been encouraged to tell you to actively use your hashtag Twitter. I'm a really bad Twitterer, so I don't do this too often, but remember, it's a desirable thing to do. Hashtag TPF15. All right, so I've already posed the question. We decided we would go in order, so I'm going to ask David to begin.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for that fabulous interview with Chelsea Clinton. I thought that was just a wonderful way to begin the day. I woke up and had a bad dream last night, and that dream related to Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. We're coming on the Christian season of Christmas, and you remember there was the ghost of Christmas past, and I thought I'd been asked up here to be the ghost of philanthropy past. But then I thought, well, at least it wasn't Scrooge. The Rockefeller Foundation that I've had the honor of chairing for the last couple of years has had to reinvent itself. It's 102 years old, and in the 1930s there was a time when we were, I think, delivering more foreign aid than the US government. That is not true today. So scale has changed everything, and we don't go it alone. We used to have a lot of university partners to help us do what we did pre-war, but things have completely changed. And so I'd like to think that we are being partly forced to and partly inspirationally led to by Judith Rodin, our president, to make collaborations with government and with business that we never thought of before. So we have become more the initial risk capital in philanthropy, and taking the risks that entities that are controlled either by voters or shareholders cannot do. So I'm here to learn a lot. The foundation is a learning institution, and I'm thrilled to be here among this distinguished panel.
Thank you. David, it's hard to follow you because you have so much experience, so anything I say will just seem like I'm antithetical, but it's, your experience is so incredible. I think, Laura, I think about this in three ways in terms of the way the world is changing and then why philanthropy needs to evolve with it. And the three things, and then we've talked a lot about one, which is cross-sector collaborations. And no longer can government solve problems by itself, no longer can philanthropy do it on its own, and no longer can civil society just stand against both, because we need a collaborative approach to addressing these challenges, and it's moving at a rapid pace. The second is technology. Whether we like it or not, technology is disrupting many things. And it's not just the app revolution, it is also about technology, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's cars, whether it's energy, healthcare, and it's making it happen at a more rapid pace than we are used to. So before, we could wait a decade and something would get adopted. Today, the adoption is happening in 2-year terms and 6-month terms. And if we're not evolving with that as quickly as that, we're going to be left behind. So we may be solving the problems of yesterday and not thinking about the problems of tomorrow. And the third is, and I think Chelsea talked a lot about this, is the millennial generation does not see grants and investments as two different things. In fact, they actually think they can be combined, and that the world can be living simultaneously and not make money on one side, give it away on the other side. And those two are coming together more rapidly today. So with that, I'd say I think there's 3 things I would put on the table. One, I think philanthropy needs to take significantly more risk than it's taking. And it's not just about qualified risk, it's more about getting out there and saying, what are the problems of tomorrow that we should be solving, not just the problems of today. So if rapid pace of change is taking place, if we're not solving for tomorrow, and I'll give you just one example to exemplify this, the driverless car is coming. Now we can fight whether a driverless car should exist or shouldn't exist, but the fact is, what if we changed our way of thinking about the driverless car and starting with poor communities first? And implementing the driverless car in those communities as opposed to waiting for the adoption to take place. But could we think that far out ahead as opposed to waiting for adoption to take place? And how do we think about that? And then the second I would just say is I think we need to rethink models of collaboration. Right now we're reinventing them in slightly modified ways, but we actually need to rethink collaboration altogether, and it's hard work because, and we're going through this with Philanthropy University, collaboration just takes time. But once those models get created, it can get repeated multiple times, and that needs to be more public.
So one thing I just want to keep in mind as we go forward, you talked about the importance of risk-taking. You talked about the importance of risk-taking, that philanthropies may, in fact, be places where you can take the most risk. But I will say that it poses for all the people in this community the fact that most innovations fail. We know that. We absolutely know that. There's a huge amount of uncertainty. We know that most fail, and it is very hard to measure impact when you're doing something that has high amount of risk and it's uncertain. So I think it's just a theme we'll get back to impact, and we'll get back to uncertainty and how you measure failure and success. I just wanted, since I heard about risk, the first 2, I wanted to get it out there. Paul.
Well, thank you. I think to make the world a better place and more sustainable and more equal, we need both philanthropy as we know it, the best of traditional philanthropy, and we need new forms, including philanthropreneurship. So 3 forms of traditional philanthropy, which I think should be here to stay, are building strong institutions, are supporting basic and applied research, and supporting policy change and advocacy for systems change. That's traditional philanthropy. And on top of this comes philanthropreneurship, which is supporting the creation of socially valuable goods and services. You know, almost all ordinary entrepreneurship is valuable because people want the jobs and people want the services and goods that are produced. But I think philanthropreneurship plays a special role where markets aren't working and where they can jumpstart markets. Let me give you 2 examples. One which is taking place in Paris as we talk. Traditional philanthropy, I think one could say that the talks in Paris would not have any chance of success were it not for the research in climate that traditional philanthropy has supported, and were it not for advocacy in the United States, in China, in developed and developing countries for policies favoring climate change. At the same time, I think there are tremendous opportunities for philanthropreneurship to jumpstart new businesses in alternative energy sources where markets don't have the patience or are not willing to take the risk, to come back to the term we're going to come back to a number of times, that philanthropists can take. And just one other example, a problem in the US, maybe peculiar to the US, is over-incarceration. Just too many people are in jail. Traditional philanthropy has been playing an important role, once again, in advocacy, trying to change government policies to reduce that. At the same time, you have some philanthropreneurship in the form of social impact bonds, supporting organizations that are working with young men who were released from prison, trying to give them counseling to prevent them from going back to prison. And what's happening in these so-called pay-for-success schemes, programs, is that the government contracts with an organization to provide the counseling to keep these young people from going back to jail. But that's pretty risky. They're not going to be paid because it's a payment for success scheme. The organizations won't be paid for several years, and it's not clear they will succeed. So once again, what one might call philanthropreneurs, philanthropic investors come and de-risk this from the government's point of view. So I think that both forms of philanthropy, both the traditional forms and some of the new forms, are really important to move to keep the world moving in what we hope is a good direction.
Another word here to keep in mind as we're continuing the conversation all day is investment. And basically, there are a whole variety of channels of funding now coming through social impact bonds, which we could go into, through social venture funds, through a traditional venture capital fund, their private equity fund that is doing social enterprise, through green bonds. I mean, there's a lot of potential ways of raising money for these risk-taking, uncertain ventures, and can actually help with the traditional philanthropies as a source of funding. So, Faye.
Thank you. So, Warren Buffett, when comparing business with philanthropy, is famous for saying, in business, you look for the easy things to do to make money. And in philanthropy, you look for the hardest problems to solve. And it's a much tougher game. I say that now and just to remind ourselves that if the problems that we're seeking to solve were easy to solve, they would have been done already. So just remember that we're working on really challenging problems in philanthropy. The other thing to remember is, and I try to remind myself of this periodically, is what does philanthropy mean? It's the love of humanity. And sometimes philanthropy begins to feel more like the love of philanthropy instead of the love of humanity. And so as I was preparing for this panel, I made a long list of things that I could talk about in terms of how does philanthropy need to evolve. But instead, I'm just going to really talk about one, which is that I think philanthropy needs to focus more on the humanity part of the equation and focus more on putting people, the people that we're seeking to help, at the center of our planning, our strategies, our measurement, and if we were in Silicon Valley, we would call that user-centered design or human-centered design. And I think we do need to be more human-centered in our design, keeping in mind what are the perspectives and experiences of the citizens and the constituents we're seeking to help all the time, and soliciting feedback from them all the time. And I'm going to tell two stories, one in which that didn't happen so well and one in which it did. And some of you probably are more familiar with the first, which is the story of the play pump. And I heard this story in great detail from Amy Costello, who was part of a reporter breaking the story for public radio. She went and saw all of these play pumps that were technological innovations that everybody was very excited about, bringing these play pumps to countries in the developing world, where if children played on the pumps, they would be able to generate water so that the women wouldn't have to walk to the wells, get water, carry it back, and so forth. So it was seen to be win-win. The children would play on the pumps, the water would be pumped, there'd be fresh water for drinking and sanitation and so forth. Amy reported on this story. Everybody was so excited about this new technological innovation. There was play, there was water, it seemed to be only good. And then a few years, and as a result of her reporting, so many more millions of dollars came to the play pump, a miracle. And then a few years later, Amy said, I'm going to do a follow-up story, see how things are going with the play pumps. And she went back and to visit some of those same villages, some of those same locations. And it was really devastating. The pumps were largely broken. Nobody knew how to repair them. The repair parts were not anywhere to be found. And the mothers, who this was all supposed to be helping, were in a very humiliating fashion trying to play on these pumps that were inefficient and broken down, trying to get water because the other pumps had been taken out of commission, the other wells. So that's a case of not being very human-centered. We can do better than that. Another case, in the United States now, unfortunately, we heard a little bit about this morning from Chelsea Clinton, we have a lot of problems with food security. Many more people are using food banks in the United States than ever before, or maybe at least since the Depression. And in mid-Ohio, there are a series of food banks, and they make food available to very poor people. And they noticed that the people who came once a month for their bag of food weren't taking any of the fresh food. They weren't taking any of the fresh produce, the fruits and vegetables. And they didn't know why. And they were scratching their heads, and they had all kinds of assumptions about why. Poor people don't like fruits and vegetables. Poor people don't eat healthy. Poor people like fast food better. Poor people are more overweight. All kinds of assumptions that they made. And so they said, well, why don't we try getting some feedback from our customers, from the people that were seeking to help with this food. And so they went about and systematically interviewed the people who were coming to the food bank. And guess why they weren't getting the fresh produce? It was because they could only come, because there was such demand, the food bank limited the visits to one time a month. So the people said, well, we don't want that food to go bad. That food is going to perish. It's perishable, so we'd rather get the stuff in the boxes and the cans and so forth. It was a simple fix. They said, okay, well, let's change it so that you can come more than once a month. As soon as they did that, the demand for fresh produce went up 500-fold. So it's important to question our assumptions. We don't have all the answers, as smart as we are, as many degrees as we have. And it's so important to do the simple thing of going to the people that we're seeking to help, be user-centered, human-centered, and ask them about their experiences, their preferences, their perceptions.
So that will hold that thought also for the technology discussion, because we can do this so much better now. Our for-profit entities know exactly what we're doing at every moment, what we're buying, what we're thinking, what we're selling, all of that stuff. So technology, peer-to-peer too. Let's go to the National Health Service. Maybe I would start by saying, Malcolm, the proposition here would be, because you are so effective in the National Health Service, there's much less need for philanthropy in the UK. How would you respond to that? Or what's the interaction between having a highly effective public health system and the role of philanthropy in health?
Well, thank you, Laura. I'm the odd one out on this panel. I'm the European. I'm someone who's spent their entire life chasing philanthropy and trying to make it work. And also I'm here now in a job which is very heavily public sector. But I can't but agree enormously with the views of the rest of the panel, which is really annoying. So what I'd like to do, I think, to concentrate on 2 or 3 key themes which for me define what all of this is about. I mean, the first is that all of this is about leadership. And there have been a number of really eye-catching global initiatives recently, the Clinton Foundation, the Gates Foundation, Warren Buffett, and of course the recent announcements by Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan. Eye-catching, vital and incredibly important, but to me is not just the fact that these individuals are devoting money to these causes. It's the example that they set across nations. I see within the NHS responsibility as non-executive chairman, but for a workforce of about 1.3 million people, serving a population of 55 million. But alongside that, we guess there's about 4 million people, largely unremunerated, providing care outside those formal settings, either as carers for spouses or disabled parents, or more generally across the community, students volunteering. People giving their time and their money to charities to support a general focus on health. That, to me, is philanthropy as a social movement, and it needs the leadership of those key announcements to make all of us feel responsible for what we do. The second issue, though, I regard as critically important is ethics. There has been a lot of skepticism about the motives of those who put large sums of money into foundations, and even the Zuckerberg-Chan gift has been questioned widely in the press. Are they in it for tax advantages, for example? Well, the question of ethics, I think, is tremendously important if we are to give the leadership and the inspiration, and it works on both sides. Where does the money come from? In my university, our students would never accept money which had come from the tobacco industry, or from money which had been earned in producing armaments and across the world. A strong moral purpose on the part of the recipient of the investment also reflects on the ethical code of those who are making the investment. Some immensely generous entrepreneurs start with the generosity they show to their own employees, the way in which they run their own business, the transparency of what they do, and the generosity of spirit that aligns their purpose throughout the whole business. And the third question, which I think is so important, is alignment and focus. And my colleagues on the panel have already discussed this, but when I was leading a university, the critical thing we had to do was to work closely with those who wished to promote some form of what we were doing already. I think the most interesting experience I had was working with a grocer, which was Lord David Sainsbury, who wanted to give $150 million for a neuroscience center, and we were in a competition. He ran a competition between my university, Oxford, and Cambridge, and I wouldn't be telling you the story had those universities prevailed in the competition, but it was like stocking the shelves. Every week we had a situation report. Every day we were charged with what we had to do, but it was entirely in accordance with what we wanted to do as scientists within the university. So to summarize, I don't think traditional philanthropy is dead. I think traditional philanthropy has an enormous future as a mass social movement. Secondly, the leadership that will come from new entrepreneurial philanthropy will infect the way in which the traditional philanthropy has worked. And I think we are on the verge of very significant change.
Thank you so much. Now, I would like to see, and I can't see too well, if there are any questions in the audience. I warned you that we would give you an opportunity before we go through first round. So I see a hand over there, and I believe someone will come with a microphone. And would you please identify yourself? And if you have a question to a particular panelist, fine, or to a general to the panel.
Sure. My name is Billy Gorta. I'm the Executive Director of This Life Cambodia, one of the 24 Stars Impact Awards winners for 2015.
Congrats.
Thank you very much. I've also studied under Professor Paul through the Philanthropy University. My apologies, I didn't actually finish the course. I was a little busy preparing for this. My question is to Professor Paul and to also Faye, because Faye, you really touched on this as well. And my statement is local communities are the experts when it comes to identifying practical ways to achieve improvements in their daily lives. Now my question is, how do we ensure that development partners listen to, engage with, and advocate alongside communities, focusing funding and resources on prioritising community-identified solutions to their own development needs?
Faye, why don't you go first? And then we'll have a tutorial afterwards to finish the course.
We were talking yesterday about how to keep the enrollees enrolled through the whole class, so we'd like to get some advice on that too later. Paul.
I think Paul.
Okay.
So I think it's a great question, and I don't think that we have the answer to it. In terms of how the role funders can play, so if I take just that one piece of it, I think that there are at least two, and maybe while I'm talking I'll think of a third. But one is to find and fund organizations who already do that. So there are plenty of organizations who are community-minded, who work with citizens in a collaborative way, who listen actively, systematically, rigorously, and respond to their interests and perspectives and experiences. So rewarding that, finding those organizations, helping strengthen those organizations, I think is one important way. A second way is to ask the organizations that we are funding if they're listening systematically to the people that they're working with, that they're seeking to help, and how are they listening, and how are they interpreting what they're hearing, and how are they using and applying it. And that's not to say that the community is always right. In fact, Rob Reich, I don't know if he's here, but he wrote a good review yesterday or the other day that I read of a book saying that actually it's not always that the community is right. And I think that's probably true. But that doesn't mean it's not always important to listen. It's always important to listen and to consider what their views and experiences are. So I think asking the question, making sure that we are systematically listening, not just in an anecdotal way. I think by asking the question, funders will catalyze, I think, more action along those lines.
I knew that if I asked Faye to go first, I wouldn't have anything that I needed to say.
But I will bring your points together because, Paul, I think you were the one that emphasized the importance of traditional philanthropy in research and advocacy. So sometimes when you have these conversations with community, what you're bringing research results. Think about what Chelsea talked about of our accumulating research on the significance of early childhood education. As we know more and more of that, we can bring that to the community as this is a reason why you should care about this, then how you do it is a community solution. So bringing together the research and the engagement with the client seems to me to be, they're two important parts of the puzzle, So over here we go.
Hi, good morning. Amel Karaboul is my name. I'm Secretary General of Maghreb Economic Forum and former minister in the Tunisian transition government. My question is for Mr. Rockefeller, and you talked about this transformation that your foundation is going through from traditional philanthropy to something else, which also involves earlier risk. I would be really interested to hear more about what is this transformation and what is helping you actually going through this transformation. Thank you.
So I gave the title of it and spoke about leading with risk, being able as a foundation to take those risks, and as Laura Tyson said, a high proportion of risky enterprises, entrepreneurial and otherwise, fail. So you really have to be ready to admit that you have failed. Very, very important. On the other hand, you want a good batting average, as we say in baseball. And what's going on at the Rockefeller Foundation at this moment is both what's always gone on and something very new. What is not new is that we focus on the poor and vulnerable populations all around the world. What is not new is that we focus on root causes of the problems that beset these communities. What is new is our way of approaching those problems and the partnerships that we seek in dealing with them. Major insurance companies, for example, looking at bundling the new climate-generated weather risks in sub-Saharan Africa for the farmers, and getting help and support from those insurance companies to cover this vast and important population of farmers who may be looking at droughts they never saw or excessive rainfalls that they never saw, and helping them deal with recovery, helping them deal with use crops that are drought resistant or heavy rain resistant, etc. So we're working on the science side, on the insurance side, and it's really very, very exciting work. And it used to be that the Rockefeller Foundation was where the money was, and we still, I'm happy to say, have the same amount that we did in real terms 102 years ago. But in proportion to the needs, it's very small. So like Willie Sutton, we too need to go where the money was. He was asked, why do you rob banks? Well, that's where the money is. The money now is actually external to us, and we need to be effective partners in gathering those funds in behind the front entry risk capital that we're willing to provide.
That's very important, and I might ask, there is an infographic that was prepared for our session. I neglected mentioning it at first. They might put it up at this point. It's an infographic about the rising role of philanthropic dollars in overall global aid dollars. I see we're running out of time, and I do want to have each of the panelists have an opportunity to say, maybe give us an example of how technology is changing what they're doing. So why don't we go immediately to that. 95% of you in a website survey said that you thought technology was profoundly changing philanthropy. Well, yes, it's changing everything profoundly, including philanthropy. So let's hear some views on the role of changing technology as in an example of how philanthropy is changing. Do you want to start, David?
Well, I'll just do a quick one. Digital Jobs Africa. An opportunity for young individuals in Africa through digital means to help cars that are parking in high garages in Philadelphia know where the empty spots are. Can you imagine?
That's a fantastic example. What an example. Wonderful. So now.
So I want to give two examples of technology, and I think one is just the access to data and how do we aggregate data. In many ways, data has always been top-down, so government decides where things are going. What we now have a lot more access is where are young people, where are communities, what does that data tell us about what the needs are and where the micro needs are? So data has a huge impact. And the second is just the use of technology to get citizen feedback on a regular basis. We've done this when I was in government. We actually started implementing tools within government to get feedback from communities on a fairly regular basis. But we need to do this more often, and the technology is rapidly evolving that it allows us to do it in a more iterative fashion. And with that, I just want to make one point, Laura, which is I think where the entrepreneurship part of philanthropy can come in is really thinking adaptively and flexibly on a constant basis, because what entrepreneurs do really well is they adapt to environments very quickly and rapidly. And as David was talking about the changes, really thinking not just about how do we wait 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, but how do we leverage technology to help us adapt faster to the changing environments that allow us to do that. And I think that's where technology has a huge role to play.
I thought your example of the autonomous car and starting first with the poor population is a wonderful example of thinking forward with the technology that's evolving, and so adaptation right away. So, Paul, some technology and how it's changing the world of philanthropy.
Technology is enabling us through the aggregation of huge amounts of administrative data to do, in effect, natural experiments with large data sets whose application to the social sector we're just beginning to see. The possibility of understanding behavior without the expense of doing randomized controlled trials is in sight.
At both ends of the spectrum, the wealth from technology is enabling these huge foundations to give away all this wealth. From Gates to Omidyar to Chan Zuckerberg to Emerson Collective, it is all technology fueled. So, I mean, that's the obvious, but it is not to be overlooked. And then at the very other end of the spectrum, mobile phones. I mean, in the developing world, the mobile phones have just jumped ahead of so much else in terms of technology. And so it's much, much easier for us to seek feedback, get feedback through the mobile phone technology. We have to be careful because more men have mobile phones than women, but still lots of opportunity there.
Let me, if I may, just build on that, because where I see technology making a huge difference is not just the democratization of philanthropy, which I think is very important and builds on those comments, but if you track what technology is doing elsewhere, look at the opportunities it gives for new approaches to philanthropy across the world. I'm thinking in particular of healthcare. Now, there are those who would say that in the next 25 years, data science will trump medical science as a major contributor to healthcare. We look now at whole genome sequencing. We can characterize individuals in a much more precise manner in terms of medical treatment, but also picking up Faye's point, the use of mobile technology and communication allows us to accelerate the effects of these revolutions away from the first world and across into the rest of the world at pace. And I think with wonderful opportunities for collaborations between state-based models of healthcare, private sector, and the NGOs and philanthropists.
So I know that I'm violating time here, but I do want to ask if there's at least one final question from the audience. I really like the notion of interaction here. This is such a distinguished group. So I'm going to go over here to, well, there's the same row. There are two people. So why don't you both say your question? We'll see if we can answer them both at the same time.
Hello, my name is Marika Bosman. I'm the CEO of the Osprey Foundation. We're a philanthropic family foundation. We work in the Middle East. I don't think I need to say, being in Paris, how important it is that we work in that region. But as we find is that in terms of partnership, it's becoming actually much harder for us to work with the banks, with the financial institutions, and with government, because the restrictions being placed on us are much larger. So I would just like to see what the panel has to say about that and how we overcome those restrictions.
I think there's going to be another panel later today on emerging markets, and I do think that talking about philanthropic challenges specific to geographies might be the right way to handle that question, but let me take the other question as well, and then we'll see. Hand went down? Okay, fine, then I think we're not going to violate our session unless you have a question over there. You're holding it up. Excellent, thank you.
I'm Rana Dajani from Amman, Jordan. I'm one of the STAR awardees for 2015 for the program We Love Reading to encourage reading for pleasure among children. My question is that you mentioned that one of the risks of philanthropy is the difficulty of measuring impact. So I'd be interested, what are the new ways of measuring impact that can advise us or inform us for the future? Thank you.
This is a great question for this panel. They think about this all the time, and maybe we'll just have some quick thoughts on this. Paul, any of you, Paul, start. Yeah.
So what I mentioned before, the possibility of big data helping is just one way. I mean, what makes, without answering the question directly, let me say why it's so difficult to measure impact. In the financial sector, you can measure impact in terms of earnings across companies doing radically different things. There's basically a single bottom line for every commercial organization. In the nonprofit sector, in social change, every kind of social change you're doing, childhood obesity, homelessness, the environment has its own measures of impact. So there's no wholesale way of doing it. You have to do it one sector at a time and sometimes one organization at a time.
I'll just only start with saying I think it's always important to figure out what outcome you want to achieve and then work backwards to how you measure that impact, because sometimes we're trying to measure impact at multiple things without knowing exactly where the outcome is. So I'd start with first, what's your outcome, and then go backwards as to figuring out what the right impact is that you should measure for the outcome that you want to do. And to answer that other question really quickly, I would just say I think this is exactly the challenge that philanthropy faces, which is you're on the Middle East piece, you're up against national security and social good, and these are, working in government, and as you have, these are the challenges that governments are constantly facing. But I think what Paul said on data can help a lot, which is understanding and using data effectively to know where the financing mechanisms are that need to stay open and where they don't. But we don't quite do that yet because we haven't quite gotten that granular.
And Chelsea started, of course, mentioning in each of the examples, she said there has been controversy and criticism of the Clinton Global Initiative or Foundation when they have worked with certain governments. And sometimes the government doesn't want to work, sometimes the government does, but then the criticism is on the philanthropy itself. So any other thoughts on impact? Yes, Faye.
I'll offer one, which is rather than starting with how do you measure, I would suggest the first question should be why? Why do you measure? You have to get to the how, but I think first asking the question about purpose, why am I measuring? What is it that I want to know? How am I going to use the information? And when? I think will help you get to a better how. Everything that Paul and Sonal said is exactly right, but sometimes you don't always need to measure impact. I know that's a little heretical for a measurement person to say, but I would say that sometimes figuring out what you need to know, and maybe it's, are things happening the way we thought they were going to happen? Are we seeing short-term changes in the way that we expected? That might be enough to get you part of the way there, and then when you're ready to measure impact, and the how will become clearer to you.
So I'm going to just end with one of the phrases that Chelsea used more than once, and that relates to your answer, and that is you start by shining a light. You start by a focus on the issue that you want to address. You understand the issue from the point of view of the people you're trying to help, and then everything follows from that. But I think shining a light is a wonderful way to end this panel. We hope we shed some light on the conversation that will follow today. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, distinguished panelists.